Welcome to the first in a Science Behind the Magic interview series. I have the wonderful Ken Liu with me, and thank you so much for joining. For those who are seeing this series, it's an author interview series where instead of focusing necessarily on the themes of the books that they create, it's more like, where did you come up with the ideas behind the real life science or societal implications for the works? Because that's something you can't ignore in all of fantasy and science fiction, is how it's inspired by, subverted, and that's the thing I geek out about. It's what got me into fantasy as a really young kid. I didn't realize till I got older that it was like all of the like sci fantasy books, like His Dark Materials and things that got me into it. And I'm like, oh, I love looking back and seeing the physics and things. And your Dandelion Dynasties and short stories, I just geek out all the time. I'm glad you've decided that Dandelion Dynasties is like a fantasy, but the wizards are engineers. I think that's a great tagline for it, because I'm always like, this is like historical sci-fi, I think, but a fantasy reader would be more comfortable because it hits more tropes.
Thank you. Well, yes, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm
Yeah, do you want
excited
to
to.
give people a brief background of who you are besides a writer? Because that
Sure.
probably, at least that informed for me when I first met you at an author
Yeah.
event, where this
So
comes
I've
from.
had a pretty weird career trajectory, but who doesn't, right, these days? So I graduated college with a degree in English. But I did not go on to pursue a career where that degree would be the most obvious choice. I went to work for Microsoft as an engineer. But I didn't, and then right after that, I went and joined a startup. Started by some friends, and I was a programmer there again. So after that first career in tech, I switched over I went to law school and became a corporate lawyer for 9 years with a federal clerkship on a federal appeals court in between. And then I went from that to being a litigation consultant. Which essentially meant that I was an expert witness in patent cases. And the thing that I got out of that experience actually is I became an amateur historian of technology. I learned a lot about the history of technology and the evolution of technology because part of that job required you to research patents and to discern in great detail the slow evolution of a technology and um, how truly difficult it is to predict which technology will succeed in the moment. So anyway, that was my third major career, and then I went full time as a writer as of 6 or 7, maybe 6 years ago. Yes, 6 years ago. Time has no meaning, right? So I've been a full time writer since then. I'm a full time writer and a futurist. So I work for think tanks, governments, large corporations, universities, where my primary focus is on telling stories about the future and how um, the very act of imagining the future shapes it, obviously, but it's also something that's incredibly difficult for people to do. And I go through techniques and work with people on how they can do that in a way that isn't necessarily more predictive, but is more helpful in terms of clarifying their own values and the entire reason for why they're engaging in exercise in the first place.
That just gives me a question about the Hidden Girl anthology. Does a lot of that come from a lot of your futuristic work? Because that's a lot of imagining what could come. At least that was my
Hmm.
interpretation.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, in particular, something that I thought was a really striking, consistent theme across the collection, because you sometimes have collections that are just like, author wrote a bunch of these stories and they're putting them
Yes.
together. And then sometimes there is like a cohesive through line, and both are wonderful. But like the Hidden Girl, I've noticed, man, we are playing with how do humans and machines potentially meld in the future pretty consistently. What was like the inspiration behind that, and how did you ground that in reality for yourself, or
Yeah.
where did you really go off base?
Okay, so my major so I'm gonna start out by saying something that Ursula K. Le Guin said much more eloquently, but I think is worth reminding people of, which is that science fiction is not an exercise in predicting the future. It's just not. Science fiction is, as a province of fantasy, is an attempt to really tell stories about the present. It's an attempt to tell realist stories, as realist as we can be in this technological age. It's an attempt to tell stories about the present that reveal aspects of the present that are otherwise invisible to us using the modes of realist fiction, if you will. So science fiction as a type of fantasy uses metaphors that are drawn from our technological age. So I sometimes say that, sci-fi is a misnomer um, for this type of fiction. It really should be tech-fi because it's really drawn from technology more than it is from science. Um, and a lot of what I do in the sort of stories that you see in the Hidden Girl and other stories is to talk about certain aspects of the contemporary world that give us anxiety that nonetheless promise a lot of transformations. And the idea here is to work out using metaphors. What are the underlying anxieties, and what are the ways that we can discern and realize as our deepest values, the values that are worth holding on to? So, for example, the in the Hidden Girl, right? There's a series of stories called the Singularity stories. So they're about the idea of uploaded consciousness. So the idea is that this is essentially the idea that the thing that Silicon Valley has been talking about forever, which is we shall upload our minds into the cloud and live there as gods. So I said, okay, let's take that premise and say we will make it true. Let's say that we make that thing, that dream, actually real. And if we do so, what are the consequences? Thank you, honey. My wife just brought me coffee. So I wanted to work that out, and fundamentally, it's a love story. It's a story about a father's love for his daughter and for his wife, and how even after this form of passage to another state of existence, he nonetheless tries to hold on to that love, which for him defined his humanity. But that is not true of the other uploaded consciousnesses. They have their own ideas about what it means to be in this new state of existence. And my inspiration largely was to try to work out literally, if the dream of the singularity in this aspect were to become real, what would it be like? How would we define what it means to be human, to be alive, and how would we define as the things that are worth holding on to? This is clearly a thing that we are anxious about, that we think about a lot, because we are in this very unique moment where machine cognition seems within reach. It seems to be a reality, either truly mechanistic cognition, or at least a mechanistic imitation and simulation or recreation of human cognition, both of which are very deeply interesting things, and they can transform the way we think of our own reality. This is the moment when the biosphere can potentially break into the technosphere in a way that has not ever been achieved before. And we don't know exactly how that would happen, and I have no interest in predicting that, but I'm very interested in working out what are the implications based on our present, and what are the ways we can sort of twist and skew our present, and see things that we don't otherwise see.
And is that basically a lot of your motivation behind short story exploration? Because I see lots of fun ideas that are very. I'm a big short story reader. I don't think that's like the normal in the sci-fi space all the time, but like every time someone writes a short story about entropy, like you did in Maxwell's Demons, I'm like, oh, I love when people describe entropy and then play with it, because it's a hard thing to play with because it's such a known fact. And in Maxwell's
Yeah.
Demons, you chose to be like, okay, entropy, it's thermodynamics, second law. We can't break it, but I want to add this spiritual component. And that's just a heart-wrenching story on baseline and exploring
Right.
our history with Japan and World War II. So it's just, how do you, did it start with entropy or did it start with Japan? How did that story come out?
Oh, well, that story started with Okinawa, right? So, I mean, it's interesting that the story is describing the context of Japan. But the very the inspiration behind that is the history of Okinawa and how Japan became Japan by essentially destroying the indigenous identity of Okinawa. And so the entire story is about how I always find it very interesting to see what readers sort of um, discern as the story, because it is interesting that many readers focus on the Japan aspect of it, when in fact, for my characters, the focus is on Okinawa, not necessarily on Japan. And it's in fact, I think that aspect may be hard for some people to pick up, just because unless you've studied the history of nation building extensively. This happened in the formation of France, the formation of Germany, the formation of even, what we would call the United Kingdom. All of these modern nation states came about essentially by destroying indigenous identities and sort of imposing an artificial standard identity on the local. And Japan is one of the last modern nation states to go through that process. And Okinawa was one of the victims. So my story was really about that aspect of it. It's about the indigenous roots, the indigenous traditions of Okinawa being incorporated into Japan, and then how an individual really is trying to find a place for themselves. Oftentimes, some of my stories are described as sort of conflicted identities, which I dislike intensely because it suggests that somehow when you are, Okinawan American or Chinese American or some sort of hyphenated identity, that's essentially a matter of conflict. I don't know why this seems to be sort of the thing that a majority, I'll just say it, a white readership imagines that those who are not majority feel, but that's just not true. You have your identity, and there's no conflict in it. Whatever conflict there is about systemic racism from the larger society and those who are in the majority, but it's not the conflict is not within. You live your identity and you live your life. There's no conflict there. The issue is rather trying to explain and trying to impose, trying to resist the idea that those outsiders are always trying to lock you into their idea about how things ought to be, which is essentially what happened in Maxwell's Demon. So that part came first, but then entropy became sort of a really nice metaphor for working out systemic racism and the idea of this larger the effort of individuals trying to live a life that feels true, that is right for them in the context of geopolitics, in the context of large empires, trying to step on and stamp out local indigenous identities.
It's I really latched on to what you were just talking about there's no conflict in identity. It's the conflict with being in your identity in the space. I think I'm interpreting that right, because that's a theme that you have in so many of your short stories and in the Dandelion Dynasty. I think it's the fourth book, Speaking Bones. You introduced a character that's only there for like 80 pages who I adore,
Yeah,
and I'm just like, oh,
yeah,
because
Zankara is great. Yes,
yeah, and I'm
I
just like,
love her.
wow, that's such a good, because I am Venezuelan American and I've always been comfortable with it until I go to the doctor and I have to fill out a form that's like asking me where do I fit within their
Right.
box and confines.
It's we don't consciously say we must perform our identity, right? We don't go around and consciously say, I am performing my identity now, until you get into these moments where, people are like, what box do I put you in? And you're like, oh, I guess you do want me to perform at this moment, right? That's the moment when this sort of performance comes into play. And it's funny. It's like we don't live in this conflicted state until like until outsiders say you must be conflicted because you must put yourself into a box here. So which box do you want to pick? Well, we don't pick boxes.
No, on average, until someone makes me pick a box. It's not until that moment that I personally ever feel that
That's
conflict.
exactly right. Yeah, yeah. That's the theme that I really want to focus on. But oftentimes, um, I've seen so my story, the Paper Menagerie, gets taught in schools a lot, and it surprises me to the extent to which uh, students and teachers often present this as a story about identity conflict, about the supposed inner conflict that those with simple, I guess I'll just say non-simple identities supposedly experience. But I don't really get that. I'm not sure where that comes from, other than, this must be imagined.
Because there's obviously conflict in the Paper Menagerie, but I always took it as more there's always conflict in following generations, and all of that is informed
There's
by
definitely
identities.
that. Yeah, definitely. And there's also the whole idea of systemic racism and how you sort of figure out how do you internalize or not internalize and how do you sort of resist it. Those are real conflicts. But the conflict isn't, do I get to be this or that? I
Yeah,
must perform, That's not really how it works.
yeah. I always and it's odd. I think some people would think it's odd that I'm bringing this up in this, but I'm always fascinated with language and brains because until
Yeah.
recently, when I started to really try and hone down my Spanish speaking skills, because I'm going to South America, and it's like I would like to be able to function. It's like, oh wow, the information I get's in the wrong order. My brain is not prepared to process. I have to rewire things, and it gets even more complex when like I'm just going from Roman language to a Roman adjacent language, and then we have so many other ones. And you really, I think, make that very clear in the first short story that I read in the Paper Menagerie, the bookmaking habits of. I'm
Select
really bad at
species.
long, and then you take those ideas and you make them even larger in the Dandelion Dynasty. So I figure we could talk about that short story for a bit, and then kind of
Yeah.
go into Dandelion Dynasty, which I don't think will be very spoilery because I don't know if you can spoil the Dandelion Dynasty in my head because it's not about big moments; it's about getting there. But that's
Yeah,
just
I get it. I get what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah. But, bookmaking habits, that just obviously feels like a lot of everything you love thinking about all the time in one spot that you just kind of you always seem to gravitate back towards ideas in that story in my experience reading your work. So if you want to expound on where it comes from and why you love
Yeah.
it.
So the bookmaking habits of select species is an example of a particular genre that I write. I call them fictional essays. So another example that I wrote recently in that genre is called Timekeeper Symphony, which is published in Clark's World. And essentially, um, these are some readers really hate this form. So they are short stories, yes, but they don't really have characters and they don't really have plot. They are, as I described, fictional essays. So they're essentially essays written in some sort of imaginary fantasy world or sci-fi world, and they treat a topic the way we would write an essay about the real world. And it's essentially an exercise in world building, and the reader is invited to craft their own stories as they read the world building exercise. So that's the brief explanation. Bookmaking Habits of Select Species, in particular, is an essay focused on the way various different alien species in the universe may choose to preserve information and to pass information on from one generation to the next. We do so by oral storytelling, but then now mostly by writing or books. So bookmaking in that sense, not as in gambling, but bookmaking. And the various alien species that I imagined would do so in different ways. Some of them do so by passing on parts of their own bodies, and some of them do so by mapping brains, and some of them do so by recording their voices in a way that um, becomes uh, when you record your voices in the way that this particular species does, you end up crafting something that is uh, damaged and transformed each time it is read. And so this becomes a very poignant thing because the very act of reading something also destroys that thing. But of course, if you are at all, conversant with literary theory, you'll realize that none of these aliens are actually aliens. They are just aspects of humanity, and these are all reflections of how humans read. Each time we do read something, we in fact do destroy it in some sense, because none of us approaches a text as a quote unquote clean thing. We all come to the text immersed in a meta text, and every reading changes the meta text. So it is true that every reading destroys the original in some sense, to the point where eventually we even forget what the original was and we don't care about it. I mean, I would say that less than 1% of 1% of the people alive today have read the Odyssey in the original. But it is a deeply influential story for all of us. Same thing with the Bible. I would say less than 1% of 1% of 1% have read the Bible in the original languages. Um, um, but, the Greek parts probably more than the other parts. But we all have, you know, we all ended up sort of uh, giving our own readings of these stories. And so, that part of it really, really fascinates me. I'm deeply fascinated by the ways that reading is both such a simple thing and yet so complicated. Language and writing are technologies, and they are among the most influential of our technologies in terms of how they shape human society and human history. And so these essays, these fictional essays, are really explorations using aliens as a metaphor to explore deeper ideas about our own relationship to language, our own relationship to reading.
And I mean, this was a connection I made because I'm coming to it with my own biochemistry background of like, not only does this happen when you read, like all of us who read books chronically know that you're not going to have the same experience as the person next to you. There's no perfect book for everyone, but also even in like the brain, right? You cannot perfectly recollect a memory. And I saw that in like one of the species there. Whenever you look at a memory, there's a pretty high theory, like it's pretty well known that you look at a memory, when you put it back in the memory bank, you're changing the neuronal path. It's never the same each time. Every
Yes,
time you look at a memory,
that's right.
you've broken it.
It's not when you remember something, right? The way our human brains work is really fascinating. We are not like computers trying to retrieve, from the ROM. We don't do that. We actually rewrite it in that process. So every single memory that we recollect becomes irreversibly changed in the very process of recalling it.
And like that's how we get those flashbulb moments, which I guess scientists haven't had one since 9/11 to really teach in classrooms. That was like a really large communal flashbulb moment where everyone can firmly say what they were doing, even though they're most of the time completely wrong. They
It's
remembered that
true.
moment so strongly, but it's like
Yeah.
I was doing XYZ, I can tell you this, and then if someone were to have a video recording, it's like actually no, that's like 2 days later you're doing those things.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Yeah.
So like those are connections that I get to make while I read your books. I really love reading your works because you think of things I love to think about, but put in all the effort of writing it down because I don't like writing that much. I just like consuming things and mulling about ideas, which
That's
that's why
kind
the
of
dandelion, huh?
that's kind of the perfect encapsulation of what I think all reading is really about. I mean, I really think that reading is deeply fascinating because it's a separate act of creation, right? Compared to the writing moment. I wrote this in the beginning of The Hidden Girl in the intro. I say that writing or fiction is a really interesting form of art because it requires two creators, right? The person who builds the house, that is the text on the story. And when I built the house, I absolutely have in my mind my understanding of human nature and my expectation of how the world functions and so on and so forth. But none of that remains in the text. All that's left is the text, which is a structure that all of us communally shape. It's built off language, which is a set of cliches we have all agreed upon, and therefore have lost their original metaphorical meaning. And we use these secondhand goods to construct a building that houses the shape, the ghost of our own dreams. And then the reader comes in and they have to move into this house using their own and unpack their own expectations and their own understanding of human nature and put up their own pictures and then make the house come alive. And they're packing it with their own understanding of an interest and their own uh, ghosts and mythologies and so on and so forth. And that moment is when the book really comes alive for them. And of course, every reader will have a completely different experience of living in this house. And yet, they all, in some way, also echo the thing that the writer left. So one of the species in the bookmaking habits is that species specifically lives literally inside the books created by other species, and that was a metaphor for this whole reading experience. That readers actually move in that way, which is, on the one hand, you can say they don't really understand the thing that the writer left. On the other hand, you can say, well, the only thing that is left that is meaningful is the thing that the reader can get out of it. So anyway, it's just really interesting to me to use this metaphor to work out that whole process.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. So I'm now going to tell everyone here who I guess hasn't read the Dandelion Dynasty, you really should. I'm going to have a video on my channel soon about why you should read it, as I do with all my Should You Read series. But I will
Thank you.
also link. It's truly, I'm so excited that something like that exists because it's a very unique form of a fantasy epic in my head, having read
Yeah.
several. And a big part of it is all of the engineering and all the problem solving. It's truly a series about people who have problems to solve, both politically, systemically, like people problems, but then there also are just like war tactics or how to win a cooking competition. Like there are
Yes.
also mechanical problems to be solved. And those are really fun things that I geeked out about basically in every book, especially Wall of Storms on, because that's when we were really entering pre-modern
Yes,
to modern era. And you
that's
just,
right.
that's just really where all the fun is. So we are going to be talking about them. We will attempt to not talk about huge plot moments, but also there are some things that happen in Wall of Storms that I don't think we can easily not discuss. So just as a fair warning, but I do think you will enjoy the Dandelion Dynasty, even hearing this discussion, even knowing things that are to come, because I'm not going to lie, I don't think I was surprised the entire time I read it, but even knowing what was coming, I was on the edge of my seat being like, oh, but how is it going to land? Like, I know this is a bad thing on the horizon. Like, when
But how?
you do like a whole like pseudo alien invasion setup, which as a sci-fi person, I'm like, oh, this isn't an alien invasion, but you're setting the beats like this
Right.
is Independence Day, and I am unhappy but thrilled. If you can't tell, I finished Speaking Bones yesterday, and I've like watched all the videos you've had because I didn't know what to do with myself after Speaking Bones.
Oh, thank you.
I was just like, oh, I don't. It's one of those beautiful books that grows on you even after you finish it. Like even after finishing the last like epilogue chapters, I'm just thinking about it. I made my partner listen to me talk about it. I'm just like, you're never going to read this because it's too long for you, but I'm just going to tell you what this author did so you can appreciate.
Thank
so,
you.
so I think, though, the first question, I don't know if you'll be prepared for, but it's something my friend Pete told me, and I think it's actually a really good question. What were things you wanted to design for the Dandelion Dynasty that didn't make it in, that you're just like, man, I can't fit this thing in, but I wish I could have?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Um, that really is a great question. So, okay, so I'll tell you my thoughts on this. So, fundamentally, the Dandelion Dynasty is an epic about modernity, right? It's an epic about how does a society from a pre-modern state emerge into modernity? Because this is a question that fascinates me very deeply. In the present world, in the world that we live in, we essentially had one narrative about how modernity emerged, which is the story of the Renaissance. And then everything else that came after is about how the rest of the world had to react to the exploration or exploitation of Western Europeans, and how the rest of us, got into modernity, either dragged into it or jumped into it or what have you. But it's always in reaction to that Western narrative, right? So that's the world we live in. But we are sort of in a moment where we're sort of re conceptualizing that narrative and questioning it, thinking about perhaps rather than a single origin story about modernity, we can tell a multi-origin story about modernity because, that story emphasizes the particular contributions of a group of conquistadors, if you will, but we don't tell the story about everybody else who also told their story in modernity and should feel at home in modernity because so often, I got to travel around the world quite a bit, and what I hear from a lot of writers from around the world is the sense that they don't feel at home in modernity. They say that, when I want to talk about economics or science or democracy or all the rest of it, I have to use the language of the colonizers. I don't, or I use a direct translation into my language, but it doesn't feel at home. The mythologies of modernity, the people we valorize, the values we care about, none of those feel necessarily native, indigenous to me. This is also part of what I was talking about earlier, this destruction of indigenous values and indigenous stories. And it's something that a lot of people struggle with. And so the Dandelion Dynasty is an attempt to tell a different origin story for modernity, sort of a reimagined modernity that includes the stories from multiple sources from around the world, that doesn't feel like a single Western drive into modernity. And fundamentally, the the path from pre-modern into the modern is a technological story, right? It's a story about explosion of technologies, but not just in the sense of machines that improve productivity, which is how we normally think about it. I think of technology in very broad terms. So there is definitely the machinery that increases productivity, sure. But we're also talking about other technologies in the form of technologies of collective decision making, technologies of social organization, technologies of military tactics, technologies of economic forms. So right in the world that we actually live in, some of the most important technologies for modernity are things like double entry bookkeeping and the corporation. These are technologies that enabled essentially the kind of age of Western European exploration that led to what we call the modern world. Um, so in the Dandelion Dynasty, I also wanted to focus a lot on those kinds of technologies. So obviously, the things that a lot of readers have focused on, and I enjoyed making them, are the soappunk machines. So how would you design a computer platform that's native to logograms, right? So that's one of the things that I was really focused on. So for example, if you go back and read that part of it, you'll realize that in an alphabetic language, you can just use the letters for as the units of input. But in a logogram world, it turns out that the way to break that down is not to use individual logograms, which there are just too many, but rather to break them down into individual knife strokes used to create the wax logograms. And so the way you would do input in the soappunk world is you're essentially playing a kind of zither, and the chords correspond to different gestures of the knives cutting. So that is how you learn to do input in this world. So I found that deeply fascinating, that sort of thing. And also, the soappunk world is deeply inspired by Benjamin Franklin and his explorations in electrostatics. So the entire stochastic force, which is their word for electricity, um, the Sogmatic engine that is at the very heart of what they do is drawn essentially from Ben Franklin's design for a electrostatic motor. Um, and so, there's that part of it is really easy to see, and it's very, very, very cool for people who love this sort of thing. And I count myself among them. So that's why I spend a lot of energy designing those machines. But I also wanted to spend a lot of energy designing social collective decision making machines. So, in the sense of social technologies, political technologies. And my only regret is I didn't get to go on long enough to design some of those, because I would have loved to design some um, alternatives to legislatures, to courts, and to bureaucracies in this soappunk world that would truly innovate on those kind of concepts. I just didn't have enough time to work out some of those implications. I wanted to come up with an alternative to the corporation, for example, that would have served similar purposes, but that would have been really interesting in the soappunk world, a soappunk version of a corporation that isn't like our version of the shareholder corporation. But I didn't get a chance to really work that out, so I couldn't really put those in. I ended up focusing the vast majority of my energy on actual machines, and only a very little bit of energy on collective decision-making organs. So, for example, the way Dara's politics works, the council versus the council providing a check on absolute monarchical power is quite interesting. And the epilogue sort of gestures at the idea that this is a world that's going to emerge from this political system into something very different. So throughout the epic, right, there's the discussion of how do we limit the power of the king, right? A good king is not enough, right? That's the refrain over and over again. But how do we solve the problem? Um, Obviously there's going to be a set of stories in place, precedents to sort of lock the power of the king, and that is one way to do it. But there are more effective ways. One of the characters at the very end that says, you know, hereditary nobles have no power except in the province of Ukiutasa. But that's not actually true. The royal family, the imperial family, actually also is a hereditary family that has power. But the implication is that that's not going to last for long. What is the alternative to that, if not a republic in our sense? What would that be? I wish I had the chance to work that out, but I just ran out of time.
Yeah, I was curious about that. As I was getting near the end, I foolishly, as a Western reader, I was like, are we going to get to voting? Is that going to happen? But also, was like, there really is no time. Like, it would be almost too fantastical. So much of the series is grounded and influenced in our best and worst moments in human
Yeah,
history.
yeah.
And I really do appreciate how you wrap it all up and how you choose to use your imagination to think of what is a different way to solve this problem that is potential. Like, what if we, like, for example, in the United States, we have this history of when we have mass groups of immigrants, we want to spread them out. We don't want them to form
Yes.
communities. Where
Yes.
you fight against that idea when you have a lot of these conversations about, well, how are we going to resolve this? What does the surrender look like? What makes it potentially fair and not catastrophic? Not
Hmm.
necessarily saying there won't be strife and conflict, but
Hmm.
what could that problem look like? I was fascinated with that. And when you were talking about the logograms and the zither, a thing that I work with electron microscopes. And so when you made the device to read the logograms, I'm like, you're just making 2D images and then you're making a kind of. I was just like, what do you, sir? I was, because I mean, when you read fiction, you don't get to read the high tech stuff a lot of the time. And I think,
Right.
I guess I don't know what someone who doesn't have my background does reading those scenes. Maybe they just glaze over and it doesn't make sense. But for me, I'm like, this is such an eloquent, simple way of explaining what would happen if you just took pictures from all angles and you then compiled that data
Right.
and like,
Right. Yeah, that part was fun too. Yeah, I really had a fun time trying to work that out. And I wrote some scripts to see if that would work, on some logograms that I made. Anyway, it was a lot of fun.
do you have a logogram nearby?
I have a bunch. So I had to make some of these as part of the writing process. So here are a couple to show you. So there's one. This is actually mutage.
Ooh,
So this is what it actually looks like.
that's my
The one
favorite word
that
in your world. I mean, for
Yeah,
obvious
the one that
reasons.
Sarah spent a lot of energy explaining to her children.
Yeah.
And this one is Renga.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
and so this came into play in Speaking Bones. So I make these out of polymer clay so I can get a sense of what they're like. This one is probably a little bit bigger than how you would obviously write them in normal everyday use. So this is more like the kind of ceremonial
Hmm.
um, kind of writing. So the way to think about it is sort of think about the way Egyptian hieroglyphics were written. I mean, obviously hieroglyphics were not a logographic language, and so it's not quite comparable. But the idea obviously is that you have the very high ceremonial version that you write, but also the much simpler form that is used in more common contexts. Logograms are like that. You can make them very elaborate for certain contexts, but again, there's different versions of calligraphy, much simpler versions.
So I think most people who've maybe seen your interviews know that you have done a lot of this engineering, making computer software to figure out what could work or what couldn't. What was the most interesting thing to try and make? Was there something you really couldn't quite create on a small scale for yourself that you wanted
There
to?
were quite a few things to do. I mean, so for example, I was trying to see if I can. So there is one, the sunflower, right? Essentially, the
Mm-hmm.
miso that uses feedback loops. It's a cybernetic device. It uses feedback loops to home in on a particular light source. Um, to build a 3D version of that was too difficult for me. I just didn't have quite enough skill to make it work. So I built a two-dimensional version of it out of Legos, and it could sort of follow a line, and it did its job. So that's what I ended up doing. So I sort of imagined that the 3D version is a much harder problem, but theoretically it could work. So that's where I ended.
And I guess I don't know enough about materials. I don't know if that material that senses light exists in our world, but it
It's
reminded me.
it's essentially like selenium. It's
Okay.
not terribly different. It's very similar in property to selenium.
Okay.
Yeah.
But all I was thinking about, because again, bringing just whatever knowledge I have in science to like make things make enough sense that I like go along and have fun, is I was thinking about the rods that we have in our eyes, because they're very binary,
Oh yeah.
light, no
Right.
light systems. And I'm like, oh, that's so fun. Because most of the things as they come to life, and this was another fun thing you did that was very not Western, is things became more animalistic. They were inspired by
Mhm.
nature when they made a lot of their devices. And I actually think a thing most people might not be prepared for is there are actually quite a few sections where you have animal perspectives. Like they're not main
Mhm.
characters, but you have moments where you are experiencing what those creatures
Yes.
are, which also connects the idea of what is intelligence and language and
Yeah.
experiencing the world.
Well, I think it's one of those things that's becoming increasingly important to us, right? So we've in here in the West, we've gone through this deep evolution, right? There's a period of time when we certainly didn't view humans as separate or separable from the rest of the biosphere and from other animal perspectives, if you will. But one of the consequences of the technological explosion and the kind of enlightenment rationalism is this weird idea that animals are really like machines, that humans are actually very unique. We are not machines because of our rationality. And so machines animals can be exploited and they have no actual perspective to speak of because they have no conscience. They're really machines. Do they even suffer pain? This is a thing that we ask all the time, which seems preposterous sometimes when you look back on it. But nonetheless, that's how we thought. But now I think the pendulum is swinging back. We are thinking more now in terms of how humans and animals are not, in fact, qualitatively different, and we are perhaps more like different points in a multidimensional space rather than even a spectrum per se. To think about the sentience of whales, of elephants, of other creatures, and perhaps sentience is not even a binary thing, but rather a gradation, a gradient of some sorts, and to sort of realize that interspecies communication is possible, and perhaps if we are now able to even use machine learning to read human minds, right? That's already achievable. We can actually literally read brain scans and discern what the individuals understand we're thinking. The days when we can sort of do so to animals does not seem that far away either. So if interspecies communication actually is possible, we really need to, stop thinking of ourselves as able to direct animals as though they are mere machines with no say and no perspective and no stake in any of this. That just I don't think that's a tenable position. We really have to think about the ethical behavior we adapt towards all the other creatures and species who live with us, who share this universe with us, and we really have to um, take a larger circle of empathy in terms of how we approach the problem.
Yeah, no, some of my favorite scenes were when you were doing the I think of them as whales. I think they're Crubins or something else, but that's what my brain always translates things, like you said. We're just
They're
always
whales, yeah.
we're just
They're
messing with
scaled
things.
whales, but yes, they're essentially whales.
But speaking of the animal population, some things are obviously very one to one. I can compare it to something in our world, but then you do have things like the Garifins, which I
Hmm.
aren't even very comparable to dragons, which is their closest counterpoint in
Yes,
mythological space.
yes, yes.
So, where did that come from? How did you create that creature?
So it's actually kind of interesting. So I've always had a lot of fascination with mythical creatures and how we sort of adapt equivalences between mythical creatures, right? So it's interesting that we like to extract serpent-like kind of mythical creatures from different cultures and call them dragons in some way, which is really fascinating because, even the Western dragon isn't particularly very serpentish, but we end up calling them dragons. And then we sort of call these kind of creatures from other cultures dragons as well, like, the East Asian long, or Ryu. We call them dragon, which is bizarre because they're not actually dragons at all. But we sort of form these equivalences and force them to do the same. So I wanted to see if I can create some sort of creature that occupies that kind of similar space, but it's very different from other um, dragon-like creatures. I've used the word dragon in a generic sense here, even though it's not particularly accurate. Dragon-like creatures in that niche. So the Garinophans are created in response to all of that. So I wanted them to be vegetarian. So they're really, my editor calls them flying hippos, which, really annoyed me at first, but I've grown to sort of like it. I was like, my wonderful, awesome creatures, you just reduce them to flying hippos. That's what you think? But there's some truth to that because they are, herbivores, and their fire breathing is largely related to their ability to ferment, gas out of the vegetal matter. So if you want to call them flying hippos, it's not inaccurate. So they're herbivores, and they breathe fire. I try to work out a plausible way where that could actually happen and how they can actually do this, and how they can actually achieve lift. Again, all related. But they're very fierce because, again, if you look at a hippo skull, it's very fierce and scary looking, and you wouldn't necessarily be like, "Oh, this is a harmless creature. It just eats grass." It's quite dangerous. So this is one of those. The Garinophans are herbivores, but they are quite dangerous. Um, so I wanted to put all of that in there and work out a plausible biology and to sort of figure out, these creatures, which end up being very deeply involved in the cultures of some of the people in my world. How would they, as a form of technology, or the herding and the riding and the use of them in war, these are technologies. How would they change the history of the world? In some ways, they're analogous to horses. The use of the horse has become very important in history, and the adoption of horses as a technology ended up being incredibly important for the Native Americans of North America, and also for people of Asia. And a lot of what I ended up writing in the Dandelion Dynasty is a working out of the Garinophans as a form of technology, both cultural and during war, how that would change society and the way we relate to animals and to each other.
Did you have as much fun as I think you did comparing Dara's? Well, obviously Dara's culture goes through so much space and time through Grace of Kings to now, but we'll say like Veiled Throne Dara, where it's at there versus I'm sorry if I'll pronounce it wrong, but the Liuko. I don't,
The Liuku, yeah.
because especially when we have the perspective where we get to not be in the occupied part of the Liuko culture, when we get to be in their homeland, when we have our main character from Dara who's over there, how she has to figure out why they don't relate to her relationship with language and the written word, and they have their voice stories. Did you have a lot of fun doing that? Because I was having a lot of fun reading the cultural
I
differences.
did. I mean, the we all sort of have our own reasons for getting into writing, and a lot of my motivation for getting into writing was because I wasn't reading the kind of stories that I wanted. The thing that always annoyed me a lot about portrayals of different cultures in sci-fi and fantasy is that because of the nature of the medium, and then because of the way we sort of approach the subject in sci-fi, we often take the approach of stereotyping and simplification when we approach cultures, right? So in Star Trek, it's like one planet, one culture, and every culture can be defined by a single word. The Klingons are all about honor, so everything must be focused around honor somehow. The Vulcans are all about logic, so everything must be focused around that somehow. There's no diversity within, like the idea that like I really take it very seriously, the idea that um, there is greater diversity within every culture than there is difference between cultures. So that is the this is sort of the idea that, if you any culture that is actually interesting, that has survived for millennia, must necessarily have within it a huge amount of internal contradictions and diversity, because that's the only way it could have survived so many different circumstances. Every culture has within it, if you will, the genes for responding to completely different situations. So the idea that every culture can be reduced down to a stereotype is idiotic. Every culture that seems deeply oppressive in some sense must also contain within it a huge amount of anti-authoritarian aspects. Any culture that seems to be deeply anarchistic must also have within it some strains of authoritarianism, because the fact that these cultures have survived for so long necessarily means that they've acquired a bunch of things that are contradictory. That's just the way it is. Every culture is a set of internal contradictions that are held together. And if you want to, emphasize, so if I were to portray Vulcans realistically, I would point out that there must be within Vulcans a huge number of thinkers who are deeply anti-logic and who are extremely dedicated to the proposition that this kind of dominant voice is wrong. And among Klingons, there must be tons of thinkers who are pushing back against the whole idea of honor. They are sort of like the Luku warriors who do not fight, who are pacifists, who deeply push those ideas. That to me is much more realistic, because real world cultures are like that. They contain within them multitudes, lots of internal contradictions. So anyway, when I was writing the Dandelion Dynasty, I had a lot of fun here. The Luku appear to be these invaders when the Dara first encountered them. They appear to be these barbaric invaders. But it turns out that in a different context, other aspects of themselves come to the fore. They have very divergent religious traditions. There are elements of the Luku that are deeply pacifistic. And there are internal debates about what does it mean to be Ryukyu, right? When you are a small expeditionary force surrounded by a large number of indigenous people that you are oppressing and trying to hold down, of course, it's natural to react by defining yourself. What does it mean to be Ryukyu? In the same way that, Japan during World War II was very dedicated to the proposition of trying to figure out what does it mean to be Japanese and to impose those ideals on the occupied territories. The Ryukyu will be the same. They are very dedicated to, it's precisely because they're under pressure that they are trying so hard to figure out what does it mean to be Ryukyu. And of course, they have internal debates about what that means. Does it mean that we kill more people, or does it mean we kill fewer people? Does it mean that we are interested in change or not? That to me is a much more realistic representation of how real cultures react to those kind of pressures. In fact, it's very much what we do all the time. I mean, right now in the United States, we're having an argument about what is the American story, who gets to be an American, who gets to tell that American story, um, and our arguments over, uh, you know, uh, over what are American values. Is the core American value everybody gets to own a gun and to point at each other, or is the core value that is not what we do? I mean, we have very passionate debates over what do the framers actually mean, and we reinterpret their stories to support our own version of it, and that. The United States is an incredibly complicated culture. Anybody who tries to characterize the US with a bunch of caricatures, we'll have to get it wrong, because it is, in fact, incredibly diverse and internally contradictory. And so I try to portray my fictional cultures with the same kind of broadness and the same kind of complexity and nuance. And to the extent that I even succeeded, even like 5%, I think I feel pretty good about that.
Yeah, I mean, my interpretation is, although it's fascinating because you can see the similarities between what humans try and do when they form groups. They want identities, but there also is the individual, that struggle. But it's like the Luyuko do feel different than the people of Dara. But then even within the people of Dara, it's like, they have all of the philosophy tenets. You have the people who just don't even care about philosophy. They're just trying to eat and exist. So the cohesiveness comes through, even though, if you look up close at the portrait, you can see all the paint strokes, like that sort of analogy.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you accomplished that, at least for me, extremely well. And we're getting near the hour for you. So I guess I wanted to open it to you. Is there
Already. Wow.
anything? I know, I mean, I'm going to respect your time, but I could talk to you for literally hours about all of the ideas that are in your head.
I know
So,
we could go out forever. This is really
yeah.
fun. Yeah.
But is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to highlight that maybe you don't always get to talk about in interviews about the Dandelion
Oh,
Dynasty?
a great question. So I guess I'll say something about the Dandelion Dynasty that I don't think I've got to talk about a lot, which is, um, the Dandelion Dynasty is fundamentally a story, a fantasy, and this is something that I think is really interesting to me. Um, it's a fantasy from a particular vein, right? So the first book, The Grace of Kings, especially, it's essentially a fantasy reimagining of the Chuhan contention. Um, so that's why it feels very historical because it's actually based on this period of Chinese history. Um, but then the rest of the Dandelion Dynasty is not historical in that sense anymore. It's a sort of a working out of the implications of a society that is perched on the border between pre-modern and modern, and how does it actually step across that chasm? Um, and because of the way I structure that, it makes the whole thing very difficult to classify. People who are really interested in historical fiction will end up sort of feeling like this is not what they sign up for. The first book is, but then the rest of it isn't. And people who want sort of pure fantasy in the sense of fantasy that has no tethering to the real world are annoyed because the first book to them feels like actually a historical retelling. And my answer to that would be just that, you know, the fact that we want books to fit into a box is sort of like the way we want people with simple identities to fit inside a box. The conflict comes from us rather than from them. The book itself is the book that I wanted to write. The series itself is the series I wanted to write. And if we could just for a moment imagine a world in which we don't have to put books into cubbies on shelves, like those genre boundaries, those classifications, those sort of expectations are just that. They are things that we build up. They don't have to be there. We don't have to actually say that every book must belong very comfortably within one of these categories. Sometimes books are what they are because they want to do their own thing and they may define their own categories or they just don't care about categories, and that's okay. Sometimes, if we don't expect things to be a certain way and just go with it, we may end up enjoying ourselves more. I guess that's what I would say.
I mean, I read primarily speculative fiction. That's the new word I use because it's just like all encompassing. It's still imperfect because it's a box, but
Hmm.
the more I read speculative fiction, I notice more often people who aren't having simple identities, they're not the simple white author, male or female. That's usually where I see these boundary lines. The Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, you can make arguments for sci-fi or fantasy all day,
Yeah. What is
every
it?
day.
Yeah. Yeah.
both groups are right. As someone who makes a booktube channel where I recommend books, I'm like, I don't like any of these subgenres. I don't know what they mean. But if you read books and you are looking for these components, I can tell you that they are or not here. And what's
Yeah.
funny to me is with the Dandelion Dynasty, if I had to pick if you like this, I don't think anyone else would pick it, but I think of Foundation by Isaac Asimov, where it's very much like, at least at the start with Grace of Kings, it's a thought experiment of like, here are the
Yes.
problems, and we're hopping through time to see when a new problem shows up and how we solve it. But
Hmm.
in your case, it's much grander, and I like it more. But like in terms of like why I think of it as a sci-fi, for me as a sci-fi reader, I think of them as deductive thought experiments.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that fantasy is really a very interesting as a genre, and sci-fi as a subgenre of that, because fantasy ultimately is about excavating what is within, right? I mean, Le Guin is the one who talked about this the most, but I think she's very right. I mean, her as a theorist of fantasy, I really her ideas resonate with me more than anyone else's. But the fundamental idea is that when we're writing fantasy, the big distinction between fantasy versus realist fiction is that fantasy is very much about excavating within. You go deep inside yourself to excavate the collective unconscious. That's what's so weird about it, right? You are going within your own solitude, and yet you're excavating this collective unconscious, which is shared with every single person who is alive, and who has lived and who perhaps will live. And you find the stuff of dreams and nightmares out of that landscape of the collective unconscious. And then I can't help but think of the game Control, which does a great job of sort of portraying that collective unconscious. But anyway, you excavate, and you bring out these metaphors that are um, images that are not explainable, right? Novelists, fantasy novelists in particular, are trying to say with words what cannot be said with words. That's the thing, right? So we bring this out, and sci-fi as a particular subgenre of fantasy is about excavating the images of technology within the collective unconscious, because as we invent, as we extend ourselves, right? So my theory about technology, this is a um, side quest, if you will, but it really does matter. Um, my theory about technology is that technologies are inseparable from human nature. Every time you work with a piece of technology like this, you're really interacting with the tangible manifestation of somebody's mind, right? This particular device represents the combination. It's literally the manifestation of the minds of thousands of engineers who have imagined and dreamed and put their minds into reality. When you're touching things around you, when you're interacting with objects of technology, you are literally interacting with the fruits, the solidified, the literal manifestations that had been imagined into being by somebody's mind. So we are constantly interacting with people's minds as we work with technology. That's what they really are. And so because we have filled our world with more and more objects that were brought forth from imagination into reality, right? The human mind is like this incredibly productive device that brings what is otherwise merely only potential into possible and then into reality. We imagine rocket ships into being, we imagine computers into being, we imagine phones and books and everything else into being, and then we put them out there. They're manifestations of our mind. Because we spend so much of our modern life doing this work of bringing forth the unknown into the known, the non-existent into existence, of course that will have an impact on our collective unconscious. We're going to infuse that landscape with technological images. So sci-fi really is about it's a genre of fantasy that excavates that space of collective unconscious and digs out these metaphors that are based on technology. And the Dandelion Dynasty is essentially an attempt to see if there's another path through the collective unconscious land where the images being drawn are not merely the one story we get to tell, but a story in which other alternatives are possible, other alternative technologies are possible, sort of a different way through the landscape, a different way of reimagining and conceiving of these boxes that allow more of us to say, maybe the boxes we have don't really matter so much because we can just get to be who we actually want to be.
Well, although I could ask another question, I can't actually think of a better way to have a final thought for this. So thank you again for joining me, being the start in this series, because it's something that has me very excited. And honestly, I'm just, whenever you send an email into the ether, you just always hope for a response. So thank you for responding and joining me today.
Thank you,
Everyone,
Angela.
really, you need to read all of his works, especially if you made it this far. You probably already have, but I don't know. I'm very excited for whatever you put out next. I will refrain from asking you what's the idea on the horizon, and I'll just wait patiently for whenever something shows up on the internet.
Thank you very much.
All right.
I'm really honored.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.